Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm talking about the new album from Squarepusher, Kammerkonzert. Alright, it's time for some new stuff from Squarepusher. I don't think anyone here needs an introduction to him. He is one of the big four popular names from Warp Records. I've already reviewed every single one of his albums, and you can find a link to the playlist of all those in the description. I have gone on record multiple times calling him my personal favorite of the Warp Records Big Four, both thanks to how he combines hyper-frantic drum and bass with jazz influences in such a distinct and easily recognizable way, along with his near-inhuman bass guitar chops that lead to him not having any true copycats like the other Warp Big Four have so many of. But also because the guy loves to experiment and make each new album of his feel different in some way. Not only has he made more than one jazz album, and more than one acid album, and more than one crazy breakbeat album, he's also made stuff influenced by prog rock, synth pop, modern EDM. He made an entire album of solo electric bass once. He made an album of classical organ music with James McVinney, which wasn't actually that good, but still, whenever this guy pops up, it's anyone's guess what new frontier he's going to be crossing next. And it'll always be an exciting time regardless of how well any given one of his experiments goes over. Well, at least that's what I used to feel, although it has felt like his work in the past decade or so hasn't been quite as daring. Be Up a Hello in 2020 was received really well at the time for returning to the basic essentials of his sound and sticking to the crazy 90s breaks and acid he became known for, but I couldn't help but feel like it played things too safe for him and ended up kinda underwhelmed by the experience. And while his last album, Dostro Time in 2024 was way better, ended up notching an honorable mention for my year-end list that year, it did also read to me like a combination of nearly all his previous eras at once, not necessarily anything new for him. At least after that album, I felt like I could be more at peace that even if the guy has run out of new frontiers to cross into, he's done so much different stuff over the years that even mixing some of his old ideas together can feel just novel enough to hook me in regardless. If he was going to enter into the late period legacy phase of his career, as so many artists of his age have, that would have been the way to do it, and still leave me satisfied. Not to mention, running out of novel ideas and sticking to stuff he's already done would have been entirely understandable for how big his catalog has gotten and how much he's been pushing the envelope for decades now. Nobody can keep up a streak like that forever, right? Well, I guess leave it to him to surprise me one more time, because this latest album, Kammerkonzert, very much is another new frontier for him. Not only is he finally returning to some of the jazzier influences, like For Real this time, that I felt had been missing out of his work through the 2020s and most of the 2010s for that matter, but he's also doing so with backing from a full live orchestra, going classical as well. Yeah, I know, if I had a nickel for every one of the Warp Big Four who put out something that took some influence from classical music just this month, it is fucking insane that I would technically have 2 nickels. But where the classical influence in those other guys' thing was a lot milder, maybe more post-rocky. The orchestra is obviously a lot more overtly baked into this album and a lot more dynamic. Squarepusher is out here, converting his usual style into chamber music or something, going both jazz and classical while sticking to the kinds of crazy frantic compositions that couldn't possibly be mistaken for any other artist. And the final result, interestingly, feels both like something of a mirror to what he did on Ultra Visitor, repeating that album's well-textured and spontaneous energy, but also being its own separate beast entirely, and goddamn, he could not have aimed an album more directly at what I personally have wanted out of him lately. I would have been immediately sold on this from concept alone, even if it hadn't been this long a time since it felt like he'd made a swing of this caliber. If this had come out around the time I was first really getting into him, like in college, you can guarantee there would have been a very poorly recorded and delivered video gushing about it. I might have even been more hyped on this back then than I already am in 2026, just for how directly it plays into what my taste was like around 10 years ago. That said, for as immediately as I was sold on the concept of Kammerkonzert, I will admit that the actual resulting album did take a while to fully click with me. This isn't exactly Squarepusher's catchiest crop of tunes. Very little here is the kind of thing which is all that likely to stick in my head longer term. Which, I mean, obviously it wasn't trying to be catchy. These compositions are more concerned with flash and excitement and labored over complexity, and that's obviously great too, but that did lead to quite a few listens of this thing which kind of ran together, and I wouldn't have been able to easily tell tracks apart from each other. It's not exactly an album where I feel like every moment is hitting for me equally. There were moments where, like, the crazy cascades of arpeggios and notes played on all sorts of different instruments simultaneously would sound like other tracks that also had crazy cascades of arpeggios and notes played on all sorts of different instruments simultaneously without as much of a way for me to, like, distinguish between them. But hey, it is still a great time, and it did get progressively better and better every time I put it on as more and more moments would click with me. Going through individual tracks, the album starts out with K1 Advance, which feels more like a album intro and warm-up to let you know what to expect out of the experience rather than much of a standout in its own right. There are loads of strings, pianos, vibraphones, woodwinds cascading all over each other, although the composition itself is very, like, stop-start, has a bit of a slow build. On its own, it doesn't necessarily feel like all the elements are, like, coalescing together into something greater, but it certainly lets you know the wide variety of sounds you'll be hearing throughout this thing. Now, the point at which things really start to get going is K2 Central, which compositionally feels like one of the slower moments on Hello Everything. Starting out with simple drum machines and catchy bass riffs that remind me a little of old tracks of his, like Theme from Sprite or Bubble Life, hitting that note of both some slightly darker menace but also some colorful playfulness. But then all the strings and bells and horns build up and swirl around it to really make it feel grand and epic in scale, and it's absolutely freaking beautiful. K3 Diligence is built around a hook of these deep tuba, piano, and horn lines that feel like a cartoon detective theme or something. Dun, 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 dun. Dun, dun, dun. But also lots of cinematic woodwinds and bells and mildly aggressive bass guitars around it to make it feel even more extravagant and give it more emotional depth and complexity in between the hooks. K4 Fairlands is admittedly a moment where my attention starts to trail off a little bit, since the melodies are a lot flightier, feel like they may have originally been improvised and converted to orchestral score after the fact. But it's also a solid jump in energy level, and it's probably the album's most electronic moment, with some actual breakbeats to underscore the whole composition, and a lot of crazy buzzing synth bass with strings to accompany it. This is exactly the kind of thing you would probably expect to hear when you see the concept of orchestral Squarepusher on paper. K5 Fremantle, meanwhile, is a big drop in energy level. It is nothing but pianos and strings for a way darker and more formless piece that feels like a creepy movie soundtrack scoring a scene of someone getting stalked in the night. It actually directly reminds me of, like, the darkest and sparsest moments on Herbie Hancock's Death Wish soundtrack, which is only a major compliment. Also, even though it's the longest track at over 7 minutes, the tension is so well built that it makes the track seem to zip by so quickly I might not even notice it sometimes. Speaking of moments with a darker mystery movie energy to them, there's also K6 Headquarters, which certainly has more going on instrumentally with more synths and jazz drumming to join the harsher string and flute progressions, although it does make the effect more unsubtle and thereby less of a standout for me. Kind of just blends into the previous track without me noticing more listens than that. Though then we get my favorite track in the bunch, K7 Museum. This is a track primarily built around harpsichord melodies, but the melodies they play are about as funky as a harpsichord can reasonably get. Like he's doing a chamber music interpretation of, like, some Stevie Wonder clavinet performance or something. And that's before it's joined by all these vibraphones and marimbas and builds into the album's brightest and most colorfully accessible moment. I also love how the track switches between, like, those A sections and some B sections which, like, re-subdivide the meter into, like, a brisker tempo and come up with, like, another new tune or other sections that let some keyboards and guitars get some, like, mild prog rock shredding in. The whole thing, once again, compositionally sounds pulled out of the Hello Everything era, or maybe even the Just a Souvenir era, and it is absolutely freaking incredible. And after that, we get a brief emotional breather, K8 Park, which is primarily a solo guitar piece in the style of the quietest and most tender moments on Ultra Visitor, or those Arcdeon interludes on Dustro Time, but with some string and piano and vibraphone backing to really make this stuff feel larger scale and more quietly dramatic. This track feels like the natural outro to K7 Museum, like the period at the end of that track's musical sentence. I often don't notice it start playing since the lead up is so seamless as to make them feel like one and the same track despite how different in tone they are. But anyway, moving on from there, the second half of the track listing is even higher energy on average than the first. K9 Reliance tends to stick to the average of sounds this album has been sticking to and not stand out for me as much. So still an extravagant mix of deep and dark pianos with lots of marimba and woodwind solos for extra playful energy. Still sounds great, though we have gotten plenty of other tracks that sound kinda like it. Though that leads into what might be the album's highest energy moment, K10 Terminus. It's a real delight hearing harpsichords and violins and marimbas just being shredded on like his bass guitar performances alongside the shuffling jazz drumming. It's like the equivalent of a chamber music live jam session, and it is nuts in the best possible way. I don't know if I'm using the term chamber music correctly. It's like if an orchestra could do a live jam session even though they can't. K11 Tideway also feels like it's jamming out, although over a darker, quieter, and again more stop-start arrangement. The pianos and string sections trading off complex runs of notes on their own with brief but tense silences in between as all sorts of like old-timey black and white cartoon energy, which is loads of fun as well. K12 Uplands is a brief minute-long interlude of guitars and strings, which is just kinda there. And then you get K13 Vigilant, which feels like it's trying to be the most chaotic and cartoonish track out of them all. Every instrument feels like it's soloing simultaneously with piano, strings, vibraphones, marimbas, horns, woodwinds, and everything in between, trading off crazy scale exercises between each other. Admittedly, this one did take a while to grow on me since, again, there are plenty of other tracks here going for the same effect, but, you know, in context it does still feel like a solidly effective raising of stakes and an eventual climax point for the album to build to as a whole. Finally, the album ends with a solo organ piece in K14 Welbeck, which is nice. Not much going on here, but, you know, a piece like this works better in this context than it did surrounded by a bunch of other solo organ pieces on All Night Chroma. Again, feels like a suitable exhale after all the craziness this album has taken you on. So there we go. That's everything on Kammerkonzert. Not much else to say besides it's about as great as I would have hoped an orchestral Squarepusher album would be on paper. As for where it might go in my ranking of all his albums, I do like this more than just a souvenir. It carries a similar creative and playful energy. I think that one might have been a little more out of the box, but this has much better actual production. Though I don't like this album more than Ultra Visitor. Those live jams have kind of just cemented themselves in my soul more over so many years, so the tunes on there, despite being equally as flighty and semi-improvisational, stick in my mind better. I think this might be roughly on par with Eufabulum, though. I'm inclined to say I like that album a little better since that one proved his sound could work really well in like a modern EDM influenced context, which is like not comparable to any other of the big IDM names. And especially if you tack on the Instrobia EP, the tunes are just a lot more memorable across the board in that package. Although both it and this album are among his best produced, and this one did really lean into my love for the jazz-centric side of Squarepusher, as well as my love for stuff like Herbie Hancock's Death Wish soundtrack, so I could theoretically see a future where this ends up growing on me even further and overtaking Eufabulum in my ranking. We shall see how that goes in the months or years to come, but all the same, this was an album that just made me happy across the board. It's one of his best projects in a very long time, and I'm feeling a strong, solid 8 to a light 8.3 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. A shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.